Morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete compound as Maya Rodriguez was dragged through the heavy iron gates, her wrists bound with zip ties that had already begun to cut into her skin. To the armed guards watching from their towers, she appeared to be just another prize in their growing collection of hostages, disheveled, frightened, and utterly helpless. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands across her face, concealing the calculating gleam in her brown eyes as she meticulously catalogued every detail of her surroundings. The compound was larger than she had anticipated from the intelligence briefings, sprawling across what had once been a military training facility in the remote mountains of Colombia. Now it served as the stronghold for Los Fantasmas, a paramilitary group that had been terrorizing the region for months. Maya's fellow captives huddled together in the main holding area, a converted warehouse with barred windows set high in the concrete walls. There were 12 of them in total: aid workers, journalists, and unfortunate tourists who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Among them was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a renowned pediatrician who had been providing medical care to rural communities; James Morrison, a photojournalist whose last assignment had been documenting the humanitarian crisis; and an elderly British couple, the Thorntons, who had been on a birdwatching expedition when their guide had led them straight into an ambush. Each face told a story of fear and desperation, but also of surprising resilience. They had formed an unlikely family of sorts, sharing meager rations and offering comfort in whispered conversations during the long, terrifying nights. The leader of Los Fantasmas, a man known only as El Coronel, ruled his domain with calculated cruelty and military precision. His real name was Marcus Delgado, a former army colonel who had been dishonorably discharged for war crimes, though his followers knew nothing of his past disgrace. He wore his authority like a uniform, his scarred face bearing the permanent scowl of a man who had long ago abandoned any pretense of humanity. His second-in-command, a woman called La Vibora, was perhaps even more dangerous. Her beauty was as deadly as her reputation, and she took particular pleasure in psychological torment. The compound housed nearly 60 fighters, most of them young men and women who had been recruited from the poverty-stricken villages or had nowhere else to turn. They were well armed with military-grade weapons, including 2 helicopters that El Coronel had acquired during a raid on a government outpost. Maya had spent 3 days carefully observing the routines and hierarchies within the compound, playing the role of the traumatized captive while her mind worked furiously to piece together an escape plan. She had noticed that the guards changed shifts at precisely 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., that the compound's generator was turned off between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. to conserve fuel, and, most importantly, that the helicopters were kept in a hangar on the eastern side of the compound with minimal security during daylight hours. The pilots were cocky and undisciplined, often leaving the aircraft unsecured while they socialized with other fighters or disappeared into the barracks for extended periods. What her captors didn't know was that Maya Rodriguez wasn't just another unfortunate victim. She was Captain Maya Rodriguez of the United States Army, a decorated combat pilot with over 2,000 flight hours and specialized training in helicopter operations, survival tactics, and counter-terrorism. Her cover story as a travel blogger had been carefully constructed by military intelligence as part of Operation Shadow Mercy, a classified mission to locate and extract the hostages before Los Fantasmas could execute them or sell them to other criminal organizations. Maya had volunteered to be captured, allowing herself to be taken during a staged ambush that had cost her team dearly. 2 good soldiers had died to make her capture look authentic, a sacrifice that weighed heavily on her conscience. Now, inside the compound, she faced a nearly impossible task. Not only did she need to escape, but she had to find a way to save all 12 hostages, knowing that leaving anyone behind would mean their certain death. The compound was surrounded by miles of dense jungle and treacherous mountain terrain, making escape on foot virtually impossible, especially with civilians in tow. As the 4th day dawned gray and humid, Maya realized that her window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Intelligence suggested that El Coronel was planning to move the hostages within the week, probably to sell them to human traffickers or use them as bargaining chips in negotiations with the government. She had managed to communicate with Dr. Vasquez and Morrison using a simple code system disguised as prayers, and they had begun quietly preparing the other hostages for what Maya hoped would be their liberation. The plan was audacious and desperate. During the afternoon shift change, when security was momentarily relaxed, Maya would break free from her restraints using a technique she had learned in SEER training, overpower the guards in the hangar, steal one of the helicopters, and use it to extract the hostages from the compound's courtyard. It was a plan with 1,000 ways to go wrong and very few chances for success, but it was their only hope. The emotional weight of her deception was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Every night, as she lay on the cold, concrete floor, listening to the quiet sobs of her fellow captives, Maya felt the crushing responsibility of their lives resting on her shoulders. Mrs. Thornton had shown her photographs of her grandchildren, speaking wistfully of the garden she tended back in Surrey. James had whispered about the fiancé waiting for him in New York, showing Maya a worn photograph he kept hidden in his shoe. Dr. Vasquez had broken down the previous evening, confessing her fears that she would never see her teenage daughter again. These weren't just mission parameters or acceptable losses in a classified operation. They were human beings whose trust she had earned under false pretenses, people who looked to her for hope without knowing that their fate depended entirely on her ability to execute a plan that any reasonable person would consider suicidal. Everything changed on the 5th morning, when Maya discovered she wasn't the only one hiding her true identity. It began with a seemingly innocent conversation during their meager breakfast of stale bread and weak coffee. Dr. Vasquez had been examining an infected cut on young Miguel Santos's arm, a 19-year-old college student who had been captured while volunteering at an orphanage. As Vasquez cleaned the wound with makeshift supplies, she mentioned specific medical techniques that seemed oddly advanced for a rural pediatrician. Her knowledge of combat medicine, pressure points, and field surgery raised red flags in Maya's trained mind, but it was the way Vasquez's fingers instinctively moved to check Miguel's pulse at his wrist and throat simultaneously. A technique used to detect deception. That confirmed Maya's suspicions. During a carefully orchestrated moment when the guards were distracted by a heated argument outside, Maya managed to get close enough to Vasquez to whisper a single word. Langley. The doctor's eyes widened almost imperceptibly before she gave the slightest nod. CIA. Maya's mission parameters had mentioned nothing about another operative being present, which meant either the intelligence had been compartmentalized for security reasons, or Dr. Elena Vasquez was operating under deep cover for reasons that went far beyond a simple hostage rescue. The implications were staggering. If Vasquez was CIA, then her capture hadn't been random. She had been here for a specific purpose, possibly gathering intelligence on Los Fantasma's connections to larger criminal networks or foreign powers. The revelation came with an unexpected complication that threatened to unravel both their covers. La Vibera had taken a particular interest in James Morrison, the photojournalist, subjecting him to increasingly personal and invasive questioning about his background, his equipment, and his reasons for being in Colombia. What the beautiful but deadly second-in-command didn't realize was that James had been secretly documenting the compound using a modified camera that he had managed to conceal during his capture. Hidden within what appeared to be a standard digital camera was a sophisticated recording device that had been capturing audio, video, and even GPS coordinates of the facility. James wasn't just a journalist covering the humanitarian crisis. He was an investigative reporter who had been tracking Los Fantasma's weapons smuggling operations for months, following a paper trail that led back to corrupt government officials and international arms dealers. Maya's escape plan became exponentially more complex as she realized that the compound held 3 separate operations that couldn't be allowed to fail. Her primary mission remained the extraction of all hostages. But now she also had to ensure that whatever intelligence Vasquez had gathered made it back to Langley, and that James's evidence of the weapons smuggling network survived to expose the corruption that kept Los Fantasmas funded and protected. The weight of these discoveries pressed down on her like a physical force, made worse by the knowledge that El Coronel had begun making preparations for something big. Extra ammunition was being distributed, communications equipment was being tested, and there was an air of anticipation among the fighters that suggested a major operation was imminent. The compound's dynamics shifted dramatically that afternoon when a new prisoner was brought in, dragged through the gates with a black bag over his head and his hands cuffed behind his back. When the bag was removed, Maya felt her blood turn to ice. The man was Captain Roberto Silva of Colombian Special Forces, her contact for the extraction phase of Operation Shadow Mercy. Silva's capture meant that her backup plan was gone. Her communication line to the outside world was severed, and worst of all, El Coronel now had in his possession a soldier who knew the real identity of at least one person in the compound. If Silva broke under interrogation, Maya's cover would be blown, and with it, any chance of saving the hostages. Silva's eyes found hers across the crowded warehouse, and in that brief moment of contact, Maya saw both recognition and determination. He had been trained for this scenario just as she had, but the look in his eyes told her that he was already planning something desperate. That evening, as the prisoners huddled together for warmth and comfort, Silva managed to work his way, close enough to Maya to whisper a devastating piece of intelligence that changed everything she thought she knew about her mission. Los Fantasmas isn't working alone, he breathed into her ear during what appeared to be a prayer circle. There's a mole in the command structure back home. Someone fed them our operational plans. This whole thing, it was a trap from the beginning. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound Maya had ever endured. Someone in the military hierarchy, possibly someone she knew and trusted, had sold out Operation Shadow Mercy. The staged ambush that had claimed 2 of her team members hadn't been the necessary sacrifice she had believed it to be. It had been an execution orchestrated by someone who knew exactly how valuable those soldiers were and how much their deaths would cost her emotionally. Silva continued his whispered briefing, revealing that the weapons Los Fantasmas had been smuggling weren't just for profit. They were being stockpiled for a coordinated attack on multiple government targets, including the presidential palace, and several military installations. The hostages weren't just bargaining chips, they were going to be used as human shields during the assault. As night fell over the compound, Maya found herself facing an impossible choice that would haunt her regardless of the outcome. She could proceed with her original escape plan, focusing solely on saving the hostages and hoping that Silva could find his own way out. Or she could attempt a more ambitious operation that would neutralize the entire Los Fantasmas threat, but would put every innocent life at exponentially greater risk. The helicopters she had been planning to steal weren't just escape vehicles. They were loaded with rockets and heavy machine guns that El Coronel intended to use in his assault on the capital. If she could turn those weapons against the compound itself, she could prevent the larger attack and save potentially hundreds of lives, but the margin for error would be virtually non-existent. The moral complexity of her situation was compounded by a discovery that Dr. Vasquez shared with her during the darkest hour of the night. The CIA operative had been monitoring communications between El Coronel and his contacts, and she had uncovered evidence that the planned assault was just the beginning of a much larger destabilization campaign funded by foreign interests seeking to exploit Colombia's natural resources. The hostages represented more than just innocent victims. They were witnesses to conversations and activities that could expose an international conspiracy involving mining rights, oil exploration, and the systematic displacement of indigenous communities. Letting any of them die would mean allowing those crimes to remain hidden forever. Maya realized that her mission had evolved far beyond a simple rescue operation. She was now the linchpin in a complex web of intelligence gathering, international, crime prevention, and moral responsibility that extended far beyond the concrete walls of the compound. The young woman who had allowed herself to be captured as part of a carefully planned military operation now found herself at the center of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and international business. The helicopter she had been planning to steal wasn't just her ticket to freedom. It was potentially the key to preventing a humanitarian disaster that could destabilize an entire region. As dawn approached, Maya knew that when the sun rose, she would have to make a choice that would define not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone she had sworn to protect. The sixth day began with an electrifying shock that changed everything. Maya thought she knew about Los Fantasmas and her own past. As the morning light filtered through the barred windows, she caught sight of a familiar figure emerging from El Coronel's private quarters, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and a distinctive scar running from his left ear to his jawline. Her breath caught in her throat as recognition hit her like a physical blow. The man was Colonel David Morrison, her former commanding officer and mentor, the same David Morrison who had personally selected her for Operation Shadow Mercy and had delivered her mission briefing just 2 weeks earlier. But this wasn't a rescue operation or an undercover assignment. Morrison was walking freely among the guards, clearly at home in the compound, discussing logistics with El Coronel as if they were old friends. The betrayal was so profound that Maya felt physically sick, her hands trembling as the full scope of the deception became clear. Morrison wasn't just the mole Silva had warned her about. He was the architect of the entire conspiracy. The man who had trained her, who had spoken passionately about honor and duty, who had held her hand at her father's funeral when she was just a lieutenant, was the same person who had orchestrated the deaths of her team members and engineered her capture. As she watched him laugh at something El Coronel said, Maya realized that every detail of Operation Shadow Mercy had been designed not to rescue hostages, but to eliminate witnesses and operatives who might have stumbled upon his involvement with Los Fantasmas. Her mind raced as she connected the dots that had been there all along. Morrison had access to classified intelligence about arms shipments, troop movements, and government operations. He could have easily provided Los Fantasmas with the weapons and information they needed to become such a formidable force. More devastatingly, he had the authority to select personnel for sensitive missions, which meant he could systematically eliminate anyone who posed a threat to his operation. Dr. Vasquez's CIA assignment, James's investigative work, even Silva's Special Forces unit, Morrison would have known about all of them and could have orchestrated their captures to prevent them from exposing his network. The emotional devastation of this discovery was compounded by a horrifying realization about her fellow hostages. Maya had assumed they were random victims, but now she saw the pattern Morrison had orchestrated. Each person had been specifically targeted because of their skills, their knowledge, or their connections. Dr. Vasquez wasn't just a CIA operative. She had been investigating medical experiments conducted on indigenous communities by mining companies. James hadn't just been tracking weapons smuggling. His investigation had uncovered financial records linking several high-ranking military officers to Los Fantasmas. Even the elderly Thorntons weren't innocent tourists. They were retired intelligence officers who had been using their birdwatching expeditions as cover for surveillance operations along the Colombian border. The compound suddenly felt like an elaborate death trap designed specifically for them, and Maya realized that Morrison's presence meant the timeline for whatever Los Fantasmas was planning had been moved up. She watched from the shadows as Morrison gestured toward the helicopter hangar while speaking urgently to El Coronel, and her blood ran cold as she understood that the assault on government targets wasn't days away. It was happening today. The helicopters were being fueled and armed for an immediate departure, and from the animated gestures and military maps spread across their table, it was clear that Morrison was providing final targeting information and tactical advice. But Maya's world was turned upside down once again when she witnessed something that defied every assumption she had made about her situation. During what she thought was a private conversation between Morrison and El Coronel, She saw her former mentor glance directly at the warehouse where the hostages were kept, then make a subtle hand signal. 3 quick taps on his chest followed, by a pointing gesture. It was a signal she recognized from her earliest training, a code used by deep undercover operatives to identify themselves to other friendly assets. Morrison wasn't just betraying his country and his soldiers, he was operating under the deepest possible cover, so deep that even his own government didn't know his true mission. The implications were staggering and terrifying. If Morrison was still loyal, then everything Maya had witnessed, the friendly conversations with El Coronel, the apparent planning sessions, even his presence in the compound, was part of an elaborate deception that went far beyond anything she had been trained for, but it also meant that he couldn't reveal himself or help her directly without blowing years of careful infiltration work. Maya found herself trapped not just physically but intellectually and emotionally, unsure whether the man she had once trusted with her life was her greatest enemy or her only potential ally. Her confusion deepened when Dr. Vasquez managed to get close enough to whisper an urgent piece of intelligence that changed her understanding of the entire situation once again. "Morrison isn't CIA," she breathed during what appeared to be a medical examination of Maya's rope burns. "But he's not Los Fantasmas either. He's working for someone else entirely, someone who wants both the Colombian government and Los Fantasmas destroyed. The arms shipments, the intelligence leaks, the coordinated attacks, they're all designed to trigger a military crackdown that will justify international intervention." The revelation hit Maya like a lightning bolt as she realized they were all pawns in a much larger geopolitical game. Morrison wasn't trying to help Los Fantasmas succeed. He was setting them up for spectacular failure that would provide justification for foreign military forces to establish a permanent presence in Colombia, ostensibly to provide stability, but actually to secure access to the country's vast mineral and oil resources. The hostages weren't meant to be rescued or killed. They were meant to be martyrs whose deaths would generate international outrage and support for intervention. As the pieces of this massive conspiracy fell into place, Maya understood that her escape plan had to be more than just a helicopter theft. It had to completely disrupt Morrison's carefully orchestrated timeline while simultaneously saving the hostages and preventing the government assault that would trigger international involvement. She had to steal the helicopter, but instead of using it to escape, she had to turn it into a weapon against both Los Fantasmas and Morrison's shadowy employers. The moral complexity of her situation had evolved beyond anything she had trained for, requiring her to make tactical decisions that would affect international relations and the sovereignty of an entire nation. The afternoon brought another devastating twist when James Morrison, who Maya now realized shared more than just a last name with her former commanding officer, revealed his own hidden connection to the conspiracy. During a brief moment when the guards were distracted by preparations for the evening assault, James managed to show Maya a photograph hidden in a secret compartment of his camera equipment. The image showed Colonel David Morrison in civilian clothes, embracing a woman and child outside a modest home in suburban Maryland. The woman was James's sister, and the child was David Morrison's nephew, a family connection that explained how James had gotten so close to uncovering the weapons smuggling operation, and why Morrison had felt compelled to have him captured, rather than killed. The personal stakes of Maya's mission suddenly became even more complex as she realized that saving James meant saving David Morrison's family, but exposing Morrison's operation might also mean destroying an innocent man who could be working undercover for legitimate reasons. The helicopter theft that had begun as a desperate escape plan had evolved into something far more significant, a single action that would determine the fate of not just the hostages in the compound, but potentially the political future of Colombia, and the safety of Morrison's family back in the United States. As evening approached and the sounds of helicopter engines being started echoed across the compound, Maya knew that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. The assault on government targets was beginning. Morrison's long-term operation was reaching its climax, and the lives of everyone she cared about hung in the balance. She had to make her move within the next few hours, but the choice she faced was no longer simply between escape and capture. It was between competing versions of justice, loyalty, and the greater good that would haunt her for the rest of her life, regardless of which path she chose. The final act began at sunset with a moment of crystal clarity that cut through all the deception and moral complexity like a blade. As Maya watched the first helicopter lift off from the compound, loaded with rockets and carrying a crew of Los Fantasmas fighters toward their targets in the capital, she saw Colonel Morrison standing in the hangar doorway, and, in that instant, their eyes met across the compound. What she saw in his gaze wasn't the cold calculation of a traitor or the desperate fear of a deep-cover operative. It was a profound sadness and a silent plea for forgiveness. In that single moment of connection, Maya understood the devastating truth that had eluded her throughout the entire ordeal. Morrison wasn't working for Los Fantasmas, and he wasn't orchestrating an international conspiracy. He was a broken man who had been forced into an impossible position by the kidnapping of his sister and nephew, James's family, and had been feeding intelligence to Los Fantasmas to keep them alive. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Morrison's apparent cooperation with El Coronel wasn't strategic deception or calculated betrayal. It was the desperate actions of a man watching his family being tortured in a location he couldn't reach, forced to choose between saving them and protecting his country. The mole Silva had warned her about wasn't Morrison at all, but someone much higher up the chain of command who had been using Morrison's compromised position to feed false intelligence to Los Fantasmas while simultaneously planning to sacrifice everyone involved, including Morrison himself, to cover their tracks. The real conspiracy was even more sinister than Maya had imagined. Someone in the highest levels of military command was deliberately allowing Los Fantasmas to carry out their assault so they could justify a massive military response that would eliminate all witnesses and consolidate their own power. With this revelation burning in her mind, Maya made the split-second decision that would define the rest of her life. Instead of stealing the remaining helicopter for escape, she would turn it into the instrument of justice that could save not only the hostages, but expose the real conspiracy behind Los Fantasmas. As the compound's guards focused their attention on the departure of the first assault team, Maya executed her escape from the warehouse with lethal precision, using techniques she had learned in the darkest corners of military training. The zip ties that had bound her wrists for days snapped under pressure applied at exactly the right angle, and the guard who came to investigate the noise found himself unconscious on the floor before he could raise an alarm. Moving through the compound like a shadow, Maya reached the helicopter hangar just as the second aircraft was being prepared for takeoff. What happened next would be remembered in military circles for decades as one of the most audacious single-person operations in modern warfare. Maya didn't just steal the helicopter. She turned it into a weapon of surgical precision that systematically dismantled Los Fantasmas' entire operation within the span of 30 minutes. Using the aircraft's rockets and machine guns, she first destroyed the compound's communications array, cutting off El Coronel's ability to coordinate with his assault teams. Then, with the kind of flying that seemed to defy physics, she used the helicopter's downdraft and rotor wash to disable the compound's remaining vehicles and scatter the guards who were trying to organize a response. But Maya's most brilliant tactical decision was realizing that her real enemy wasn't Los Fantasmas at all. It was the person who had orchestrated this entire situation from within her own command structure. Using the helicopter's communication equipment, she began broadcasting on military frequencies, not to call for help, but to expose the conspiracy in real time. As she hovered over the compound, she transmitted Morrison's location, the evidence that Dr. Vasquez had gathered, James's photographic documentation, and, most importantly, the identity of the real mole who had been manipulating events from the beginning. General Patricia Hawthorne, Morrison's direct superior and the person who had ultimate authority over Operation Shadow Mercy. The revelation that General Hawthorne had been orchestrating the entire conspiracy sent shockwaves through the military command structure. Hawthorne had been using her position to feed information to Los Fantasmas while simultaneously planning their destruction, intending to emerge from the chaos as the hero who had eliminated a terrorist threat while secretly profiting from arms, sales, and resource extraction rights that her private military company had negotiated with foreign investors. She had selected Maya for the mission specifically because Maya's psychological profile suggested she would focus on saving hostages rather than questioning the larger strategic picture, and she had never anticipated that Maya would be capable of the kind of tactical thinking that could unravel years of careful planning. As government forces mobilized in response to Maya's broadcasts, the situation in the compound reached a crescendo of violence and revelation that would change everyone involved forever. El Coronel, realizing that his operation had been compromised from the beginning, made a desperate attempt to execute the hostages rather than allow them to be rescued and become witnesses against him. But Maya had anticipated this final desperate move, and in a display of flying skill that bordered on the supernatural, she landed the helicopter directly in the compound's courtyard, using its rotor wash to knock down the guards while simultaneously providing cover for the hostages to run to safety. The rescue itself was a masterpiece of tactical planning and emotional intelligence. Maya didn't just extract the hostages. She orchestrated their escape in a way that preserved the intelligence they had gathered and ensured that their testimonies would be heard by the right people. Dr. Vasquez's CIA evidence was transmitted directly to Langley. James's photographs were uploaded to secure servers that would make them impossible to suppress, and even the elderly Thornton surveillance data was preserved and forwarded to the appropriate international agencies. But perhaps most importantly, Maya managed to save Morrison himself, extracting him from the compound just as Hawthorne's loyalists arrived with orders to eliminate all witnesses to the conspiracy. The aftermath of Operation Shadow Mercy would reverberate through the intelligence community for years. General Hawthorne's arrest led to the exposure of a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government and international business. Los Fantasmas was dismantled not through military force, but through the exposure of their financial networks and political connections, which proved far more effective than any assault could have been. The hostages became heroes whose testimonies helped reform military oversight and intelligence operations, while Morrison was quietly reassigned to a position where his expertise could be used without the burden of command responsibility. For Maya herself, the mission's end, brought a complex mixture of vindication and profound loss. She had saved everyone she had set out to save, exposed a conspiracy that threatened democratic institutions, and proven that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with superior firepower, but with the courage to question authority, and the skill to turn desperate circumstances into opportunities for justice. But the cost had been enormous. Her faith in the military hierarchy had been shattered. Her relationship with Morrison would never recover from the secrets and deceptions that had nearly destroyed them both, and she carried the knowledge that her success had come at the expense of others who had died because of Hawthorne's manipulations. The helicopter that had been meant to be her escape vehicle had instead become the instrument through which she transformed herself from a soldier, following orders, into a warrior fighting for justice on her own terms. As she stood in the debriefing room weeks later, facing a panel of investigators who were still trying to understand how one person had managed to unravel such a complex conspiracy, Maya realized that her real mission had never been about rescuing hostages or stealing helicopters. It had been about learning to trust her own judgment, to see through deception and manipulation, and to have the courage to act on her convictions even when the cost seemed unbearable. The woman who had allowed herself to be captured as part of a carefully planned military operation had emerged from the compound as someone entirely different, not just a decorated pilot or a skilled operative, but a person who understood that true heroism sometimes requires abandoning the mission you've been given in favor of the mission you've discovered for yourself. The helicopter she stole had carried her not just to safety, but to a deeper understanding of justice, loyalty, and the terrible beauty of choosing to do what's right even when the world seems determined to make such choices impossible.